1885, Louisiana. The secret bunker at the theater where 15 artists were brutally imprisoned. In the sweltering summer of 1885 inches, the vibrant port city of New Orleans, Louisiana, local authorities uncovered a secret so horrifying that the related documents were immediately stamped, classified, and buried in the city's archives for nearly half a century. 15 people were discovered imprisoned in iron cages within the damp, labyrinthine catacombs beneath the magnificent Royal Theatre, their bodies bearing the marks of malnutrition, brutal forced surgeries, and psychological control through hypnotism. What made this case even more chilling was that each victim had been declared mentally ill and was supposedly admitted to non-existent asylums, with forged documents filed in the courts of 4 southern states. The mastermind, Elias Thornwood, was a charismatic impresario who had operated the seemingly legitimate traveling show, Thornwood's Marvelous Library, for nearly a decade. But behind the glittering stage and enthralled crowds lay a brutal empire that turned human beings into commodities, one of the most savage exploitation schemes ever recorded in the history of the Gulf Coast. Major newspapers were prevented from publishing the naked truth, and those who knew were threatened into silence by a network of corrupt officials who had profited from this nightmarish enterprise. Before we continue the story of Elias Thornwood and his marvelous library, I want to ask you something important. If stories like this ignite your curiosity, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest historical mysteries. And I'm very curious, where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below and tell me your state or city. Now, let's pull back the curtain on what really happened in New Orleans in that terrible summer of 1885. The truth that exposed Thornwood's empire came not from an official police investigation, but from a courageous, anonymous letter sent by someone who had seen through the cruelty hidden behind the stage lights. New Orleans in 1885 was a city caught between 2 worlds. The old French Creole heritage with its wrought iron balconies and shaded courtyards was confronting a chaotic wave of industrial progress. The port bustled with steamboats, carrying goods from all over the world, and streams of immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and newly freed African Americans, all seeking a future in this promising city. The population had swelled, creating a place where a person's past mattered less than their ability to survive and seize opportunities. This look-the-other-way attitude was the fertile ground Elias Thornwood needed to sow and cultivate his criminal empire for years without detection. Thornwood himself was a charismatic figure, a former Confederate surgeon with an aristocratic demeanor and a sharp gaze that commanded respect. He claimed to be a descendant of a wealthy English family, though no one bothered to verify it. What mattered was that his money was real, and he spent it lavishly in the riverboat casinos and private clubs of the French Quarter. In 1878, he purchased the magnificent Royal Theatre, ostensibly to serve as the headquarters for his traveling show, Thornwood's Marvelous Library. On the surface, the Marvelous Library was a high-class vaudeville show of the era. It featured magicians, burlesque dancers, and yes, a collection of haunting living wonders. Such shows were extremely popular in late 19th century America, where crowds paid handsomely to gaze upon the strange and unusual. What made Thornwood's show stand out, according to those who saw it, was the mesmerizing quality of the performances and a mystical, almost supernatural atmosphere. There were the conjoined twins Alistair and Beatrice, billed as bound by destiny, 2 bodies moving in an unnervingly synchronized way. There was the Bornean savage, a man whose skin was covered in intricate tribal tattoos, who could supposedly communicate with spirits. But most memorable was Lila Beaumont, known as the Voodoo Priestess, a young woman with empty eyes who would sing chilling prophecies in a mournful voice, while the ritualistic scars on her face seemed to glow under the stage lights. What the audience never knew was that many of these stars had not voluntarily joined Thornwood's troupe. They had been carefully selected, collected through methods whose full depravity would only be understood when the horrific secret beneath the theatre was exposed. The police chief of the French Quarter, Harlan Duval, was a man well acquainted with the under-the-table deals in the chaotic world of New Orleans. A handsome monthly payment from Thornwood, enough for Duval to live a life of luxury far beyond a public servant's salary, ensured that he would turn a blind eye to the increasing number of missing person reports, especially those that strangely coincided with the Royal Theatre's talent recruitment drives. Dr. Lucien Moreau arrived in New Orleans a year after Thornwood, carrying a tarnished reputation from Paris. Claiming to be an experimental psychologist specializing in the hidden potential of the human mind, he rented a discreet office on Rue Royale and quickly became Thornwood's indispensable partner, serving as the official spiritual advisor to the performers. What the city didn't know was that Moreau was a master of hypnotism and mind manipulation. His true expertise was not in healing, but in breaking the human will, turning people into obedient, docile puppets through a combination of hypnotic suggestion, hallucinogenic drugs, and fear. The three men, Thornwood, Duval, and Moreau, had created what they believed was a perfect criminal empire. They would identify suitable candidates from the dark corners of the city and neighboring ports, people with disabilities, the mentally unstable, or simply lonely immigrants with no one to look for them. Orphans and dock workers were particularly valuable targets. Their method was sophisticated and cruel. Moreau, in the guise of a philanthropist, would organize free health clinics or spiritual awakenings for the vulnerable. Once he had their trust, a dose of chloroform-laced tea or a light touch on the shoulder, accompanied by a hypnotic command, would render them unconscious. When they awoke, they were in the damp catacombs beneath the Royal Theatre, with no memory of their past, trapped in a nightmare they didn't know how they had entered. But the true horror of Thornwood's operation went far beyond simple kidnapping. It was a systematic process of completely breaking down a person's identity and rebuilding them as living wonders, using techniques that combined deep hypnosis, forced surgery, and psychological manipulation. The goal was not just to make them perform, but to make them believe they had no choice, no past, and no future beyond their role in the marvelous library. The first crack in Thornwood's carefully constructed empire appeared not with a scream, but with a piece of parchment quietly sent. On a sultry August evening in 1885, an anonymous letter was delivered to the clinic of Dr. Amelia Voss. Voss, a pioneering female physician and a defender of the downtrodden, was preparing to close when a delivery boy handed her an envelope with no return address. Inside, on a piece of old parchment, were a few hastily scrawled lines. "The living ghosts are under the Royal stage. Stolen souls, save us." Below was a strange spiral symbol. Initially, Voss thought it was a cruel joke from those who opposed her work, but a few days later, a man named Jacob Riley was pulled from the Mississippi River, emaciated and nearly unconscious. He was presumed to have drowned 2 years prior. When he awoke in Voss's clinic, Riley only mumbled fragmented sentences. He spoke of eyes in the dark, a master who steals souls, and of being forced to stare into the spinning light until he forgot his own name. What horrified Voss the most was a freshly healed scar on Riley's skull, the mark of a crude trepanation. "He said it would help me hear the voices of the spirits," Riley whispered, his eyes filled with a wild terror that Voss would never forget. "But I'm not a psychic. My name is Jacob, I think. They told me Jacob was dead. They showed me papers that said I was insane and dead." Voss was initially skeptical. The man's story was too outlandish, and his mental state too fragile for her to wonder if he was suffering from trauma-induced hallucinations or some form of hysteria. But something in his desperation, the specific details he provided, especially the trepanation scar and the genuine terror in his eyes, convinced her that he was telling the truth about something terrible. He described the catacombs under the Royal Theatre in astonishing detail, including old tunnels leading to the river that Voss knew to be real from old city maps. He spoke of specific individuals, other captives, providing stage names and describing the experiments they endured, details too consistent and horrific to be delusions. Most compelling of all, he knew things about Thornwood's business operations that no outsider could possibly know. "There are journals," Riley whispered, his voice growing stronger as memories flooded back. "Dr. Moreau keeps them in his office. They record all the hypnosis sessions, what he did to our minds, the false memories he implanted. Thornwood calls us his sculptures. Some of the records go back years, Doctor, years." As Riley continued his story, Voss began to understand the scope of what he was describing. This was not merely a case of exploitation or abuse. It was an organized criminal enterprise, combining pseudoscience, surgery, and psychological control that had been operating in the heart of New Orleans for nearly a decade. The realization filled her with both horror and a powerful sense of duty. If Riley's story was true, she was facing a crime against humanity. But first, she needed proof. And getting that proof meant confronting some of the most powerful men in New Orleans, men with the resources and connections to make anyone who got in their way disappear without a trace. Jacob Riley's return to lucidity was not a miracle, but a fatal mistake by his captors. During a previous desperate escape attempt, he had been beaten nearly to death and thrown into a drainage tunnel leading to the river, left for dead. But an unusually heavy rainstorm had washed him out of the catacombs and into the Mississippi River, where he was found by a fisherman. The shock and trauma had temporarily broken Moreau's hypnotic control. The catacombs beneath the Royal Theatre were a maze of damp, dark tunnels divided into holding pens by iron cages. Each cage held one person, chained to the cold stone wall. A complex locking system designed by Thornwood ensured that only he and Moreau could open them. Riley's cage had once been next to that of Leela Beaumont, whom the audience knew as the Voodoo Priestess. Through broken whispers between hypnosis sessions, he learned her real name and her tragic story. Lila was a young Creole girl, possessing a haunting beauty and a mesmerizing voice, who was approached by Moreau in a market with promises of fame. Instead, she was kidnapped, tattooed with fake voodoo symbols, and hypnotized into believing she was a cursed priestess. In another cage were the twins Alistair and Beatrice, whose real names were Thomas and Marie, two Irish orphans taken from a church. Thornwood had performed a brutal surgery, grafting a section of their skin and muscle together to create the illusion of conjoined twins, a perfect wonder for his stage. The constant hypnosis and psychological manipulation had made them forget their past and know only dependence on each other in their shared horror. The terror of their situation went beyond physical confinement. Thornwood and Moreau worked systematically to destroy their victims' identities and hope. They were given stage names, fabricated stories, and constantly hypnotized by Moreau into believing the outside world had forgotten them, that they were mentally ill and had nowhere else to go. Fake mental commitment papers were prepared by Police Chief Duval and filed with courts in different states, making Thornwood their legal guardian. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even more cruel than the surgical scars. Moreau would use stolen personal items to create fake seances where the victims spoke with the spirits of relatives, hearing them express relief at being freed from the burden of their very existence. For many of the captives, especially those who had been held for years, this systematic assault on their memories and their connection to the outside world had been devastatingly effective, turning them into empty, completely submissive shells. Voss spent the next week quietly investigating Riley's claims, and what she discovered sent a chill down her spine. A review of mental commitment records filed in New Orleans and neighboring parishes over the past 7 years revealed a disturbing pattern. An unusually high number of immigrants, poor people, and individuals with unusual physical traits had been committed to obscure asylums, often with the signature of Police Chief Duval, and cursory investigations. More troubling was the discovery that the descriptions of many of these patients bore striking resemblances to the performers in Thornwood's marvelous library. The dates also correlated almost perfectly with the theater's new talent recruitment drives. Armed with this preliminary evidence, Voss decided to confront Police Chief Duval directly. It was a risky decision. Duval's office was in the Cabildo, a stately space that reeked of bourbon and decay. When Voss arrived on a humid afternoon, she found the chief admiring an ornate dagger, an act that seemed calculated to send a message. "Dr. Voss," Duval said, his voice as smooth as molasses, but without looking up from the blade. "I hear you've taken a special interest in the less fortunate of our city, a most noble endeavor." Voss had prepared for this conversation, but facing Duval in his lair, surrounded by symbols of power, she felt a cold dread creep up her spine. Nevertheless, she pressed on with her inquiry about the commitment papers and their suspicious coincidences. Duval's response was swift and laden with menace. He placed the dagger on the desk with a dry click, stood up, and moved closer to Voss, invading her personal space. "You know, Doctor," he whispered, his friendly tone gone. "New Orleans is a dangerous place. People can easily disappear in the alleys of the French Quarter or be struck down suddenly by yellow fever. It would be a shame if a respectable woman like yourself were to meet with such an accident." He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Focus on healing the living and let the lost souls rest in peace." But Duval had made a critical error. In his arrogance, he had inadvertently confirmed Voss's suspicions while simultaneously revealing his own involvement in the conspiracy. Voss, though her heart was pounding, maintained the composure of a scientist. Every word Duval spoke, every threatening gesture, was further evidence of the corrupt network that had allowed Thornwood's empire to flourish. Voss left Police Chief Duval's office convinced she was in mortal danger, but also more determined than ever to expose the truth. She knew she couldn't rely on local law enforcement, and any public attempt to contact federal authorities could be intercepted by Duval before any action was taken. Her solution was both audacious and extremely dangerous. If she couldn't bring the authorities to the evidence, she would bring the irrefutable evidence to them. Over the next week, Voss worked with Jacob Riley, who was slowly recovering under her secret care, to plan an infiltration of the Royale Theatre. Riley's knowledge of the tunnels and Moreau's routines would be crucial, but the plan would require precise timing and no small amount of luck. The goal was not a full-scale rescue. That would require more resources than Voss possessed. Instead, they would gather undeniable proof: Moreau's hypnosis journals, Thornwood's surgical instruments, and, if possible, photographs of the captive victims. Voss, with her knowledge of medical photography, prepared a compact glass plate camera. But as they prepared for this dangerous mission, neither Voss nor Riley realized their activities had been noticed. Moreau, with the instincts of a paranoid manipulator, had begun to doubt the story of Riley's disappearance. He didn't believe in the drowning story. On an evening late in August, as Voss was reviewing old maps of the theater, Moreau made a disturbing discovery. An inspection of his supplies revealed that several vials of a powerful sedative and a few empty notebooks were missing items a fugitive could use to record a testimony. But what sent him into a panic was when he realized one of the hallucinogen-laced voodoo dolls he used to control, Lila, had vanished from the prop room. The realization that someone had not only escaped, but had taken evidence, sent Moreau into a frenzy. He immediately contacted Thornwood and Duval, and the three men began to implement what they called the cleansing protocol, a plan they had prepared for the possibility of their empire being discovered. The cleansing protocol was simple in its brutality: eliminate all evidence, including their sculptures themselves. What Voss and Riley didn't know was that their planned infiltration had been anticipated. Moreau's discovery of the missing items had prompted the conspirators to drastically accelerate their timeline. Instead of waiting to see what evidence might be gathered, they decided to eliminate the threat entirely. On the night of the 15th of August, 1885, as Voss and Riley approached the Royale Theatre under the cover of an approaching storm, they walked directly into a carefully prepared trap. The building appeared quiet, just as Riley had predicted. Thornwood and his associates typically spent their evenings at a private riverboat gambling club, where the Creole elite gathered for business and pleasure away from prying eyes. This routine had given Riley his initial chance to escape, and Voss was counting on it to provide the cover they needed. They entered through a sewer grate leading into the catacombs that Riley knew well. Inside was pitch black, filled with the smell of damp mold, filth, and something else. A sweet, cloying scent of jasmine, a fragrance Voss couldn't immediately place, but it was overpowering and unsettling. Using a heavily shaded oil lantern, they began to navigate the maze of narrow tunnels. What Voss saw in that dim light would haunt her for the rest of her life. The victims were in far worse condition than Riley had described. Many were severely malnourished, their bodies bearing grotesque surgical scars, crude stitches, and signs of medical experimentation. Some appeared to be in a deep hypnotic trance, their eyes wide but vacant, responding only minimally to Riley's whispered words. The twins, Thomas and Marie, were huddled in a corner of their cage, the scar connecting them infected and inflamed. Their emaciated bodies trembled, and their eyes held a hollow fear that spoke of minds broken beyond repair. When Riley called their real names, they only looked at him with a fleeting spark of recognition before burying their faces in each other's shoulders. Lila Beaumont was in even worse condition. The voodoo priestess was now a mere shadow of herself. Her haunting voice was gone, replaced by senseless mumbling. Her once soulful eyes were now dull, a result of constant forced use of hallucinogenic drugs and Moreau's hypnotic sessions. She was conscious, but seemed to be completely lost in an internal world crafted by her captor. As Voss began to set up her glass plate camera equipment to document these horrors, Riley moved between the cages, trying to communicate with the other victims in broken whispers. It was during this process that they made a discovery that transformed their understanding of Thornwood's operation from merely criminal to something demonic. In a deeper stone cellar, once used for storing bootleg liquor, they found Thornwood's surgical and experimental room. Blood-stained wooden operating tables were lined with surgical instruments, bone saws, and glass jars containing preserved body parts. This was where Thornwood performed his enhancements, but what was more horrifying lay on another table. Moreau's laboratory, hypnosis charts, pendulums, and thick journals written in French. The detailed notes described experiments in memory implantation, pain tolerance under hypnosis, and what Moreau called the dismantling and reconstruction of personality. But the most damning evidence was found in Thornwood's office, located in what was once the theater's management room. Hidden behind a rotting landscape painting was a safe. Inside were the ledgers Riley had described, but their contents were far more extensive than he remembered. The ledgers contained detailed records of 38 individuals who had been collected for the marvelous library over a period of 7 years. Each entry included their real name, place of origin, the circumstances of their abduction, and the stage persona created for them. More disturbing were the scrawled notations next to some of the names. 15 individuals were listed as current assets. The other 23 were marked as failed projects or liquidated, a euphemism that Voss realized with a shudder referred to victims who had died during surgery, couldn't withstand the psychological torture, or were murdered when they were no longer of performance value. The notes even indicated where their bodies were buried, unmarked graves in the remote swamps outside the city. But as Voss was carefully photographing the ledger pages in the dim light of her lantern, a creak from the iron door at the head of the tunnel sent a chill down her spine. Heavy footsteps were descending towards them, accompanied by angry whispers. The trap had been sprung. The sweet jasmine scent Voss had noticed earlier suddenly became overpowering. It was an incense mixed with a powerful anesthetic, and the concentration in the air was increasing rapidly. Someone had been burning it in sensors placed in the catacombs' ventilation system, probably for several minutes before they realized they were in danger. Riley, who had been trying to calm a panicking victim, suddenly collapsed onto the damp stone floor. Voss, fighting against the dizziness and nausea, managed to hide her camera and the exposed glass plates in a crevice in the wall before her own consciousness began to fade. The last thing she saw before passing out was the elegant figure of Elias Thornwood descending the stone stairs, a silver-tipped cane in one hand and a pistol in the other. Behind him were Police Chief Duval and Dr. Moreau, along with 2 large thugs. As consciousness faded, Voss realized with crystal clarity that she and Riley were about to become the next entries in Thornwood's ledger, marked as failed projects. When Voss awoke, she found herself in one of the iron cages, her hands cuffed to the cold metal bars. Her medical bag was gone. Riley was in the cage next to hers, still unconscious. The next several hours brought a level of terror that Voss, despite having witnessed much suffering, had never imagined. Thornwood, Moreau, and Duval took turns interrogating her, demanding to know who else she had told about their operation and whether she had managed to send any evidence to her Pinkerton contacts. Their methods were brutal but calculated. Duval used crude threats of physical violence, describing in detail what would happen to Riley if she didn't cooperate. Moreau used more subtle, hypnotic techniques, trying to break into her mind with pendulums and soothing whispers, searching for a weakness to exploit. But it was Thornwood who was the most terrifying interrogator. His approach was cold and analytical, like a scientist studying a specimen. He seemed genuinely curious about Voss's motivations, asking detailed questions about her investigation, her beliefs in science and humanity. It gradually became clear that Thornwood wasn't just after information, he was evaluating her. He was considering whether a pioneering female doctor could be reconstructed into a new living wonder for his stage, perhaps a prophetess of science, imprisoned by her own knowledge. "You have an extraordinary presence, Doctor," Thornwood mused during one of their sessions. "A sharp intellect, a strong will. With the right adjustments and training, you could be a phenomenon on stage." He circled her cage, his eyes assessing. "I'm thinking the Oracle of Painful Truths or the Cursed Physician. We could build an act around your tragedy. A brilliant scientist driven mad by the forbidden discoveries she has made." The casual way Thornwood discussed turning her into a performing commodity was perhaps more terrifying than any physical threat. It demonstrated a complete lack of human empathy, a view of humanity as mere clay for him to mold into grotesque shapes at his will. But even as she endured these interrogations, Voss was gathering information, her analytical mind working ceaselessly. The interrogations revealed that the operation was even more extensive than she had initially realized. Thornwood had contacts along the Gulf Coast, a network of corrupt officials and human traffickers who helped identify and procure suitable candidates. More disturbing was the revelation that the marvelous library was not Thornwood's only source of income. He also ran what he called midnight salons, exclusive performances for members of wealthy Creole secret societies who paid premium prices for more intimate and depraved entertainments. These private shows often involved forced, humiliating, and violent mock voodoo rituals, and it was these shows that brought in the majority of Thornwood's profits. The cleansing protocol triggered by Voss's investigation involved more than just eliminating witnesses. It was a plan to completely erase their tracks in New Orleans. Thornwood had already begun making arrangements to move his remaining assets to a facility in Cuba, where a corrupt plantation owner had agreed to provide cover for his activities. The plan called for the murder of all current victims by flooding the catacombs, the destruction of all records, and staged accidents to kill anyone who could connect them to the operation. This included not just Voss and Riley, but also several dock workers who had asked too many questions, and even the low-level thugs they considered security risks. Just when we thought we had reached the depths of depravity, the secret under the Royale Theatre runs deeper still. If this story is sending shivers down your spine, share it with a friend who loves Gothic mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's find out how fate will turn the tables. But Thornwood had made a critical error in his calculations. He had assumed Voss was acting alone, driven only by a doctor's compassion and personal curiosity. What he didn't know was that Voss maintained a secret and professional relationship with the Pinkerton Detective Agency, specifically with a senior agent named William Sterling, who had assisted her in several investigations into illegal post-Civil War activities. Before breaking into the theater, Voss had sent a coded telegram to Sterling. It was more than just a report. It was a fail-safe protocol. She had stated her suspicions about Thornwood and Police Chief Duval's involvement. She instructed Sterling to initiate a federal investigation into human trafficking in New Orleans if he did not receive an all-clear message from her within 48 hours. That 48-hour deadline was rapidly approaching, and Sterling had already begun mobilizing his resources. Furthermore, he had taken the precaution of sharing Voss's concerns with his contacts in the Department of Justice and trusted journalists in New York and Chicago, ensuring the story could not be completely suppressed, even if the worst happened to Voss. On the afternoon of August 17th, as Thornwood was finalizing his cleansing plan, a telegram arrived at Police Chief Duval's office and changed everything. It was addressed to Duval himself, but its contents were clearly an intentional warning. The telegram came from Agent Sterling of the Pinkertons, and it was deliberately worded to seem like a routine business inquiry. It read, "Chief Duval, our agency is conducting an investigation into entertainment companies with interstate business operations. Request assistance in arranging a meeting with Mr. Elias Thornwood of the Royale Theatre and Dr. Amelia Voss regarding medical matters for immigrants. Federal marshals will be present to assist. Arriving New Orleans, August 19. William Sterling, Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the telegraph operator, a gossip with connections to the underworld, immediately informed Duval. But news of federal marshals and the Pinkerton agency spread like wildfire through the city's corrupt officialdom. That evening, a pale-faced Duval delivered the news to Thornwood at the gambling club. The realization that federal marshals and the Pinkerton agency were targeting his operation sent Thornwood into a panic. The cleansing protocol, designed to handle local threats, was completely inadequate against a federal investigation and national press attention. Worse, the telegram's mention of Dr. Voss indicated she had somehow communicated with the outside and may have already shared evidence. If that evidence was in federal hands, Thornwood's network of corrupt officials would be useless. Faced with the collapse of everything he had built, Thornwood made a final decision that would lead to his downfall. Instead of trying to flee, he decided to accelerate his timeline and implement the most extreme version of the cleansing protocol. He would eliminate all the victims immediately by flooding the catacombs with river water, staging a levee breach caused by the storm, a not uncommon tragedy in New Orleans. Then, he and Moreau would disappear on a cargo ship to Cuba. The plan was desperate and poorly conceived, but in his panic, Thornwood couldn't see any alternatives. What he didn't realize was that his panic-driven decision to move quickly would give his victims and the authorities the opportunity they needed to end his reign of terror. The night of the 17th of August, 1885, began with the implementation of Thornwood's cleansing protocol. He and Duval ordered their henchmen to open the large sluice gates connecting the catacombs to the Mississippi River, using the strengthening storm as cover for the natural flooding. The plan was to drown all 17 captives, including Voss and Riley, eliminating all physical evidence of their existence. But one of Duval's henchmen, a young Irish immigrant named Finn, who was tasked with guarding the cages, had finally reached his breaking point. The young man had been haunted by guilt and the muffled screams he heard every night. The prospect of watching 17 people, including a kind doctor and a fellow countryman, be murdered in cold blood was more than his conscience could bear. Instead of standing guard, Finn made a desperate decision that would save multiple lives. He ran through the storm to a small church on the edge of the French Quarter, where Father Michel, an old priest known for his courage and his help for the poor, was praying. Father Michel initially dismissed Finn's frantic story as the ravings of a drunkard, but the young man's detailed knowledge of the tunnels and his accurate descriptions of people the city believed to be lost or insane gradually convinced the priest he was telling the truth. Together, they developed a plan. Father Michel would gather a group of dock workers and veterans loyal to him, while Finn would return to the theater and try to delay the opening of the sluice gates by sabotaging their mechanisms. But their plan faced a critical obstacle: time. The Mississippi's waters, pushed by the storm, had already begun to leak into the lowest tunnels. Moreau had begun to walk past the cages, swinging his pendulum and whispering final suggestions, a ritual designed to put the victims into a state of paralysis, to accept their fate without a fight. Finn's return to the catacombs was a masterpiece of desperate improvisation. He told the other henchmen that Duval wanted to move a few of the most valuable assets to a higher area before the water rose, buying precious hours while Father Michel was gathering his men. Meanwhile, in her iron cage, Dr. Voss was working on her own desperate escape plan. The exposure to the anesthetic gas and the threats had left her exhausted, but her scientific mind remained sharp. She had noticed that the hinges of her cage, though sturdy, were bolted into a section of old brick wall, damaged by years of dampness. Using a metal hairpin she had managed to hide, she began to pick away at the crumbling mortar around the bolts. The process was slow and meticulous, and she had to be careful not to let the guards notice her efforts during their patrols. As the night wore on and the water began to rise to their ankles, several elements began to converge in ways none of the participants had anticipated. Voss's hinge finally gave way around the same time Finn was implementing his delaying tactics at the entrance, and just as Father Michel's group, armed with lanterns and clubs, began to enter the tunnels, Voss's escape from her cage was only the beginning of an even more dangerous phase of her ordeal. The catacombs were still guarded, The water was rising, and she was weakened by hours of captivity and psychological torture. But Voss's knowledge of anatomy and medicine, along with what she had observed during her brief captivity, allowed her to move methodically through the maze of tunnels and reach the other victims. What she found when she began to unlock the cages was a testament to both human endurance and the devastating effects of prolonged psychological manipulation. Many victims were so heavily drugged or deeply hypnotized that they couldn't comprehend what was happening. They just stared at her with vacant eyes. Others, especially those who had been imprisoned for years, were terrified that any act of resistance would result in worse treatments from Moreau. Riley, though still weak, proved invaluable in convincing the other victims. The fact that he had escaped once and returned gave him credibility, and his fragmented memories of each person allowed him to communicate effectively, awakening faint sparks of awareness in their minds. But their liberation efforts were complicated by the physical condition of many victims. The twins, Thomas and Marie, were too weak to walk on their own, their surgical wound making every movement agonizing. Lila Beaumont had developed a severe respiratory condition from constantly inhaling the anesthetic incense. Several others had injuries from Thornwood's experiments that had been deliberately left to fester as part of his control mechanisms. As they worked to free as many people as possible, Voss and Riley could hear increasing activity in the main tunnels. The shouts of henchmen, the rush of fast-moving water, and loud crashes indicated that Thornwood and his cronies were implementing the final phase of the cleansing protocol, breaking the main sluice gates to let the floodwaters in with full force. The situation reached a crisis point when Moreau, growing suspicious of Finn's delays, decided to venture deep into the tunnels himself. His discovery of Voss's empty cage and the ongoing liberation efforts triggered a frantic alarm that brought Thornwood and Duval rushing down into the catacombs. What followed was a chaotic confrontation in the flooded tunnels. 15 weakened victims were caught between their rescuers and their captors. Thornwood, armed with a pistol and backed by Duval and his henchmen, seemed to have the advantage of position and firepower. But in his rage and desperation, Thornwood made a critical tactical error. Instead of rounding up the victims, he became obsessed with Dr. Voss, viewing her defiance as a personal affront to his intellect that demanded immediate punishment. This fixation gave Riley and a few of the more mobile victims the opportunity to lead the others towards a secret exit that Riley knew. Their escape was aided by Finn, who had returned and created a diversion in another tunnel branch, drawing away some of Duval's men. The confrontation reached its climax when Duval, pursuing Riley and 2 other victims, encountered an unexpected obstacle at the exit of a sewer tunnel. Father Michel, who had arrived with a group of dock workers armed with clubs and lanterns. The priest's presence and his group were not an official rescue team, but a desperate act of courage after hearing Finn's story. They had arrived faster than anyone expected by knowing the shortcuts through the French Quarter's alleys. The sight of Father Michel and an angry mob in his domain sent Duval into a panic. His first instinct was to try to use his authority as police chief to disperse them, but this group, all too familiar with oppression, did not back down. In the ensuing chaos, with victims staggering out of the tunnel and Father Michel's group confronting the henchmen, Thornwood made his final desperate gamble. Instead of surrendering or trying to flee, he retreated into his office with Moreau and barricaded themselves inside. Their plan was to burn all the journals and ledgers, destroying all evidence, and then negotiate their way out. What they didn't realize was that Voss had hidden her camera and the plates she had taken of the most damning ledger pages in a crevice in the catacomb wall, a secret known only to her and Riley. The standoff in Thornwood's office lasted nearly 3 hours. During this time, the federal marshals, alerted by Agent Sterling's telegram, arrived, bringing with them the authority of the federal government. Outside the barricaded office, a remarkable scene was unfolding in the flickering lantern light and the abating storm. 15 human beings, people who had been erased from society and mental health records, were being cared for by Dr. Voss and Father Michel, their names and stories being recorded. Many were in terrible physical condition, needing immediate medical care, but all were alive, and most, in lucid moments, could provide testimony about the nightmare they had endured. The breakthrough in the standoff came from an unexpected source. Jacob Riley, the Irish immigrant whose mind had been damaged by the experiments, suddenly experienced a moment of furious clarity when he heard Moreau's hypnotic voice through the door. The rage that erupted from this nearly broken man was terrifying. With the help of the dock workers, he began to use a wooden beam as a battering ram to smash down the office door that Thornwood and Moreau had blocked. The heavy furniture that could stop a few men was no match for the collective strength of men accustomed to hard labor and filled with righteous anger. In minutes, they had created an opening large enough for the federal marshals to storm in. Moreau's capture was accomplished without violence. The hypnotist had collapsed into a state of nervous exhaustion, mumbling nonsensically in French and offering no resistance. But Thornwood proved more resilient. When the marshals entered the office, they found him calmly feeding the last of the ledgers into the fireplace. "Gentlemen," he said, his arrogant tone undiminished, "I'm afraid you're too late. Whatever fanciful stories you believe you can prove have turned to ash along with these papers." But Thornwood's confidence was misplaced. Even as he destroyed his records, Dr. Voss was working with investigators to reconstruct the operation based on the photographs she had hidden and the testimony of the survivors. More importantly, Finn's detailed confession about the day-to-day operations provided investigators with information that no written record could have contained. The arrest of Police Chief Duval was almost anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his corruption and the testimony of multiple witnesses, he immediately tried to negotiate a plea deal in exchange for information about Thornwood's broader network of accomplices in other southern states. But perhaps the most important moment of that horrific night came when Lila Beaumont, the voodoo priestess, whose voice had been silenced by drugs and torture, began to hum. It was a Creole lullaby her grandmother had taught her as a child, a melody of comfort and hope. One by one, the other survivors joined in, some only able to produce faint sounds. Their voices, hoarse and damaged, but still human, filled the damp tunnels with a sound that was both heartbreaking and triumphant. As dawn broke over New Orleans, the full scale of Thornwood's empire began to come into focus. The 15 survivors represented only a fraction of the victims who had passed through his hands over the years. The other 23 individuals listed in his ledger as failed projects would never have the chance to see justice served, their bodies lying somewhere in the swamps. The trials following the exposure of Thornwood's operation became a scandal that rocked the nation, exposing the lines of human trafficking and disguised slavery that still existed after the Emancipation era. The case was covered extensively by newspapers from New York to San Francisco. Elias Thornwood was ultimately convicted on 38 counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and manslaughter. The evidence against him was overwhelming, combining physical evidence from the catacombs, Dr. Voss's photographs, and the haunting testimony of the survivors who had found the courage to speak publicly about their ordeal. His execution by hanging, carried out in 1887, became a focal point for debates on the criminal use of hypnotism and the nature of evil. Dr. Lucien Moreau received a life sentence after fleeing to Europe and being extradited back. His detailed confessions about his psychological manipulation techniques provided medical experts with horrifying but valuable insights, helping them understand the full extent of the psychological damage inflicted on the victims and develop appropriate treatments and support. Police Chief Harlan Duval's cooperation with prosecutors earned him a reduced sentence, but he died in prison of yellow fever before completing it. His testimony about the corruption network led to the ousting of numerous officials in New Orleans and neighboring port cities, shaking the region's already rotten political foundations. The fates of the 15 survivors varied dramatically. Some, like Jacob Riley, were able to gradually rebuild their lives with support from the Irish community and the dedicated care of Dr. Voss. Jacob became a powerful voice against the exploitation of immigrants, working at the docks to warn newcomers of the city's dangers. Lila Beaumont's recovery was more limited. Years of psychological manipulation and drug use had left her with permanent mental scars, but she found peace in a convent in rural Louisiana. Her voice never returned to its former glory, but she found solace in tending the convent's garden until her death in 1928. The twins, Thomas and Marie, after a successful separation surgery by Dr. Voss, were adopted by a kind family and grew up together, rarely speaking of their horrific past but maintaining an unbreakable bond. Dr. Amelia Voss's investigative articles on the Thornwood case, published in medical journals and progressive newspapers, established her reputation as a leading social reformer. She continued to run her clinic, but also campaigned tirelessly for the reform of asylums and the protection of the rights of the vulnerable. She never forgot the lesson she learned beneath the Royal Theatre, that science without morality is the cruelest form of all. The involvement of Agent William Sterling and the Pinkerton Agency led to broader investigations into criminal networks in the South. The partnership between Voss and Sterling, a combination of science and law enforcement, continued to expose several other illegal operations. In the 1890 seconds, the Royal Theatre was shut down and became known as Haunted, eventually being destroyed in a mysterious fire in 1895. The site remained vacant for decades, a scar in the heart of the French Quarter. It wasn't until 1940 that the city erected a small fountain on the location with a discreet bronze plaque dedicated to the lost souls of New Orleans, a vague reminder of the 15 survivors and the 23 victims who never saw justice. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Thornwood case was its effect on law and public perception. The case demonstrated the need for stricter oversight of private medical facilities and asylums, and highlighted the dangers of pseudoscience and unethical experimental methods. More importantly, it exposed the vulnerability of marginalized populations, immigrants, orphans, and those deemed different to exploitation and abuse. The publicity surrounding the case led to the establishment of organizations advocating for the rights of mental patients and contributed to reforms in civil commitment laws. The case also had a profound impact on the world of entertainment. The abuse of hypnotism and exploitative human exhibits were strongly condemned, leading to new laws requiring proof of voluntary participation and safe working conditions for performers. However, even as justice was served and reforms were implemented, disturbing questions remained. Duval's testimony revealed that Thornwood's operation was just one part of a much larger underground criminal network that supplied human commodities to wealthy and depraved clients throughout the Gulf and the Caribbean. While many of his accomplices were eventually arrested, others simply vanished, presumably continuing their activities in new locations with new identities. The investigation also revealed that some of the individuals listed as failed projects in Thornwood's ledger had actually been sold to other operators in Cuba and elsewhere. Despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, most of these people were never found, and their ultimate fate remains a mystery. Perhaps most troubling of all was the discovery that Thornwood's empire had been able to operate for so long, precisely because it exploited societal prejudices and indifference. The ease with which an immigrant could be declared insane, the willingness of officials to accept bribes to look the other way, and the appetite of a segment of the public for dehumanizing entertainment all contributed to creating an environment where such horrors could flourish. In the end, the Royal Theatre case serves as both a testament to human resilience and a warning about the capacity for evil that exists when greed, power, and scientific hubris combine in the absence of accountability and justice. The 15 people who survived Thornwood's marvelous library had their identities officially restored, their psychiatric records voided, and their stories preserved for history. But somewhere in the damp alleys of America's past, how many other voices remain silenced? How many other victims of similar operations never found their way to freedom? This mystery shows us that the most horrifying monsters in history have always been entirely human, driven by greed, and enabled by corruption and indifference. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.